Good morning. I did not hear that bell, so that's why I'm a little late. Thought I had a couple minutes to chat. Obviously did not. Neither did you? Yeah, you got here about the same time I did, Jerry. All right, let me think what's going on. Dave Bowen's cousin's wife passed away out at Heartland, and I don't have any other information regarding that, but keep that family in your prayers. Elaine Wallace was taken to the Cleveland Clinic yesterday. She came to Memorial Friday afternoon with blood clots in her legs, and they were unable to get a room Friday, but they finally had a room open up at the clinic yesterday. So around 2 yesterday afternoon, she was transported to Cleveland, so keep her in your prayers. I'm going in my mind through the folks I saw at the hospital Friday, and there's no one from the congregation that I can recall. Everything else of importance will be in this morning's bulletin, so be sure to pick one up before you leave after our morning assembly. David's going to have our prayer to begin class this morning, so David. Thank you, David. I also meant to mention to you Bruce Taylor. Most of you know Bruce. If you've been around here very long, Bruce is Barb Casto's son-in-law, Debbie's husband. He fell off the roof of their home this past week, broke his leg in 2 places and injured the other leg or foot. He's in the hospital, going to have a couple surgeries or so, please keep him in your prayers and that whole family. He was getting on the roof with a backpack leaf blower, clean out gutters. He thought it would be easier to do it that way. Obviously it wasn't, and made a real mess of his leg, so he's going to be laid up for a while. All right, to our study as we continue to look at Bible geography and modern history. We have covered a lot of territory over the last quarter and are wrapping things up here in the next week or two. Today we focus at first on Jordan. As you can see on the map, Jordan is located east of Israel. It gets its name because of the Jordan River, which is the western border of this country. And Jordan has a reputation as being a pro-Western state in a world that generally is not pro-West. If you look at Scripture, Old Testament in particular, Jordan occupies today the lands that were occupied by the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Moabites. And interestingly, this past Thursday in our ladies' class, these 3 countries came up, and so I asked the ladies, what are the roots of these peoples? The Ammonites and the Moabites are tied very closely together, but so are the Edomites. And I was pleased that somebody at least could answer the question. Remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19? God's revelation to Abraham that the cities are going to be destroyed, and Abraham's bargaining with God until ultimately God said, for 10 righteous souls, if you can find 10 righteous souls in the cities, I will spare them. But 10 souls could not be found. In fact, 4 left the city, only 3 actually escaped. Lot's wife turned back and became a pillar of salt. But Lot and his daughters, and Lot was the nephew of Abraham, they escaped. And following their escape, the daughters got their father drunk, went into him in successive nights. Children were conceived, and those children were Moab and Ammon. So the Moabites and the Ammonites are direct descendants of Lot and thus relatives of Israel, because their father was Abraham's nephew. So you connect the Moabites and the Ammonites with Israel through Lot. And the Edomites are direct descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. Abraham's promised son was not Ishmael, it was Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau, the older of the two. That's a big deal if you're twins. And yet, he did not receive the elder's inheritance. He sold his birthright, the double portion, to his brother, we would say for a bowl of soup. And Jacob then became the dominant factor in Abraham's lineage through which Christ would enter. But Esau was the father of the Edomites, and they inhabited that region along with the Moabites and the Ammonites that is now modern Jordan. We just went through that story. I want it to stick in your memory because when you look at Old Testament history, it sometimes may appear to be rather disjointed, but it really isn't. There's a story to be told, and told with a purpose. Everything in the Old Testament is designed to help us understand and appreciate how God brought his Son into the world to fulfill the promise first made in Genesis 3:15 that the head of the serpent would be crushed, but in the process, the heel of the crusher would be bruised, and this one who would crush the head of the serpent would be of the seed of woman. And of course, that's not the customary way of speaking. It is typically seed of man, but in this one unique case, man will not be involved. The one who will crush the head of the serpent is none other than Jesus, who was born of the Virgin Mary. She knew no man prior to her conception. He was conceived in her womb of the Holy Spirit. And so he is the seed of woman. And all of this stuff that we've been studying really is there just to help us appreciate what God ultimately accomplished. And he did it over a period of almost 1,000 years. That is, from the time the promise was made to Abraham until it was realized in the womb of Mary was really 1,000 years. Abraham is about 1950 BC, give or take a few years. And so 1,000 years after the promise was made to him, which is recorded in Genesis 12, and thereafter God fulfilled it. And all of these peoples that we have been identifying with, they had interaction with Israel. Many of them conquered Israel, and yet the plan was never in jeopardy. God was in control. This is also the region, by the way, where the 2.5 tribes settled. You know, when they came into Canaan under the leadership of Joshua, they came on the eastern side of the Jordan River through what is now Jordan, the lands of Edom, Ammon, and Moab. And once they had made that route north, then they moved west across the Jordan River. But 2.5 tribes determined that the land east of Jordan was ideal for them. They were herdsmen, shepherds, and this just was perfect for their occupation. And so they requested permission to settle there. And that permission was granted with one proviso. They had to agree that they would cross the river with the other 9.5 tribes, and they would work with the army of Israel to defeat the enemies. That would be the Canaanites and the Philistines and all of those that inhabited the region of Palestine. And when that mission was accomplished, then they could go back across the Jordan and occupy that section of territory we now identify as Jordan today. They made that agreement and fulfilled it and thus settled there. So this is the territory that Israel had following the conquest. Now, if you remember last week when we looked at those maps, all of Israel's territory today is west of the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. They have nothing on the eastern side, and that's because that's where the nation of Jordan is. They obviously are far more prominent in the Old Testament than the New Testament. The Moabites and the Ammonites have faded out of the picture by the time that Jesus has arrived. There are still remnants of the Edomites. Their destruction was predicted in Scripture and was ultimately realized in the 2nd century A.D. And if you read the New Testament today and encounter Idumeans, the Idumeans are the Aramaic term for the Edomites in the 1st century. The last of the Idumeans were destroyed in the early 2nd century A.D. This is a picture of what's called the Mesha Stela, and it's just a stone monument that was uncovered by archaeologists that describes how Mesha, the king of Moab, defeated Israel, and it's on display if you ever go to Paris in the Louvre. You can actually see this stone. And this is something you might be familiar with if you've watched any of the Indiana Jones movies. This one was prominent in at least one of those movies. It's actually in southern Lebanon, the remnants of ancient Edom, which is also, by the way, called Seir, S-E-I-R. So when you read in the Old Testament of Seir, it is the exact same location as Edom, and they're synonymous terms. This is the treasury of ancient Petra. The Edomites actually lived essentially in cliffs. They fled from invading armies and were able to build fortified structures and were almost impregnable. So they lasted for a long time. But this is an example of one of their greatest works from the 4th century, early 312 BC, in fact. And it's one of the 7 wonders of the world, new wonders. And you do see this. I've seen it in National Geographic and other publications. It's quite impressive. Carved out of solid stone. These are the current rulers of Lebanon. You probably, if you watch much news, have seen both of these. The current king is Abdallah II, or Abdullah. He came to the throne in 1999. I think I was at the Cleveland Clinic when his father came there having health issues back in the the late 80s. I remember this vividly because when pulled in, they were out on their hands and knees literally scrubbing the street in front of the main entrance, and flowers were everywhere. They had closed the floor above where the king would be and the floor below the king, and the king had the whole middle floor to himself, and I don't remember what that was, but it was pretty impressive. It's interesting when people want the best health care in the world, they don't go to Canada, and they don't go to England, and guess what? They don't even go to Cuba. They come here, and his father was coming to the clinic. The Queen is actually from Kuwait, of Palestinian lineage. They're very pro-Western, pro-U.S. in particular. This is an aerial view of one of the refugee camps in Lebanon. Lebanon has a large population of Syrian refugees, but not nearly as, did I say Lebanon? I meant Jordan. Jordan has a large segment of Syrian refugees, but not nearly as many as Lebanon that we're going to look at in a few minutes, I suspect. This is about 80,000 Syrian refugees living in tents and makeshift structures and being cared for out of funds provided by the UN, by the Jordanians and others. And I'll just throw this out for you. This is what needs to be done with refugees right now. Rather than bring them here and resettle them, they honestly don't want to be here. They'd like to be at home. We should be providing the funds and the security so they can live in camps like this, where they have water and food and shelter, so that when that Syrian civil war does end, and all wars eventually end, they can go back home. But in our way of thinking, I mean the Western world, we just need to open up and invite them in. And Germany did that, and I think they were trying to do something very commendable, but I believe they would tell you it didn't work. And Angela Merkel's in a little hot water in Germany over that very thing. And it really isn't the best way to deal with it. Now, who am I? How can I know that? I just know that if it were me, I wouldn't want, if I could be safe close to home, that's where I'd want to be. I wouldn't want to uproot and, take off and live somewhere where I'm not going to fit in and don't really want to fit in, and most of them don't. So these kinds of things actually do work well when they're properly done, but for some reason that hasn't been the mindset of late. Whether you like him or not, I think our president-elect has a better idea about how to deal with this than some others. But that's just what I think, and I labeled it as such, so take it for what it's worth. But these folks are being cared for. And when the war ends, and it will end, it's not that far back home. And by the way, just as an aside, have you noticed who all the refugees are when you see them? Young men in their late teens through their mid-30s. If those men, this is just my opinion, if those men were real men, they'd be back home fighting for their families and defending their country, not fleeing like cowards. That's just my opinion, but I don't understand it. And again, I look at what's happened in Germany and the problems they've had with rape because of who they brought in and how they react. That just shouldn't happen. And if they stayed close to home and had the necessities, or if they had the guts to stand up and fight, it would be a different story. But again, just my opinion, and I'm labeling it as such. That's all I want to share with you about Jordan. You can locate it on the map now. It's just that country east of Israel. And it is, to a great extent, stable. The king and queen are loved. They have a degree of freedom in Jordan, and Jordanians have a relatively decent lifestyle. We go from Jordan to Lebanon, which is north of Israel and west of Syria. Before the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 75 to 1990, Lebanon was a very stable country, reasonably prosperous, a large tourist industry. The Lebanese have a special place in my heart for one specific reason. 1972. Driving from Lubbock, Texas to 100 West Virginia with a Pinto pulling a U-Haul. Now, those of you who are my age know, Pintos barely pulled themselves, let alone a U-Haul. But here I am with all of our earthly possessions in this U-Haul on the interstate in Missouri when I get a flat tire, on the trailer, and there's no spare. So my thinking is just unhook the trailer and drive to the next town and get somebody to come out and fix it. But my companion, we can't do that. We can't leave that trailer. It's everything we own. Well, it couldn't have been worth more than $150. We didn't own much. All right, so I get out and start walking. I leave her in the car with the trailer attached, and here I am on this 4-lane walking to the next town when a car pulls over. It's 2 Lebanese watch salesmen. Could have been nicer people. And the fellows took me, I think it was to the next stop, and I got out and I thanked them profusely and called U-Haul, and they sent somebody out to pick me up and go fix the tire. But I've always had a special place in my heart for the Lebanese ever since. I also like that character on MASH, so. Greg got that. Greg is a TV aficionado, if you didn't know that. Greg turns his TV on at 6 in the evening or sometime sooner, and he turns it off in the morning when he gets up around 9:30 or 10. I kid him about that as well. 9:30 or 10, did you catch that? That's not Greg. All right. In the Old Testament, Lebanon was famous for what? The cedars of Lebanon. A man by the name of Hiram provided Solomon with the necessary cedar to aid not only in the building, provided David with the necessary cedar to build his house, and then assisted Solomon with the building of the temple. And when you think of Lebanon, this is what you normally think of, the cedars of Lebanon. Lebanon was a part in the Old Testament of northern Canaan, and thus became the homeland of the Canaanites. And their descendants, the Phoenicians, were a seafaring people all over the Mediterranean. 2 cities that you associate with the Phoenicians would be Tyre and Sidon. And we mentioned those earlier when we were talking about Alexander the Great and his efforts to destroy Sidon and what he had to do to accomplish that. In 1920, following World War I, this area was part of what was called the Mutas Seraphiate. And it was predominantly Muslim with Shia and Sunni. It became Greater Lebanon under the direction of the French. Now, remember at the end of World War I what happened to the Ottoman Empire, which is today modern Turkey, and was at the beginning of the last century an extensive empire. 3 pashas decided that they would align themselves with the Axis powers. And when they were defeated, the Ottoman Empire just was simply dissolved. And it was distributed among the French and the British and the Russians. And you may recall that little pact that the British had made in 1916. Never really was carried out to its fullest extent, but it was an effort for the British and the French to kind of leave Russia out, and that didn't happen. And these conflicts that we've been seeing, the Putin and Russia, and all, there's nothing new about this. 100 years ago, it was the Russians and the British and the French and the Austrian and German segments, and things as different as they are don't change all that much. And then in World War II, what do we have? And again, we end up with the Russians and the West and the conflict and the Cold War and all of that. So if you think things are different, they really aren't. It's the same players and essentially the same problems. But part of the French mandate, Syria and Lebanon. 1983, Beirut barrack bombing. Most of us in this class, with some exceptions, I saw Michelle and Stephen come in, they're clueless about this. But old people like us, we remember the barracks bombing and how many Marines were killed and French peacekeepers. We're talking about this region of the world. Beirut was the major city of Lebanon. This place has been a mess pretty much ever since, by the way. On August the 6th, 2013, or as of, Lebanon has almost 700,000 Syrian refugees. Now think about that. Can you imagine having that influx of Canadians coming across the border and basically camping out? It'd be a little hard because it gets pretty cold across the border to our north. But we have something akin to this, don't we, in our southern border? Only they don't come across and form refugee camps. They scatter in all directions, and we have mayors now that are providing them sanctuary, even the criminal elements, and it's just really hard to comprehend. I will tell you from a personal perspective, if I lived south of the border, had a family, I'd do everything I could to get north as well. That probably by hook or crook. I don't fault them for wanting to be here, but there's a process. It ought to be followed, and we have laws that ought to be enforced, or you end up not having a country. You have a country that's overrun by others, and that's not good. I know that's not the right thing to say, but that's never concerned me before. Why should it concern me now? It's just the facts. And I'm not anti-Semitic. I have nothing against Jews or Arabs, and I'm certainly not anti-Mexican. I happen to think that, they're hard workers and wonderful people. I'm going to be having lunch at a Mexican establishment, I'm told, later this morning. And I know some of those fellows by their first names and just really like them. But they're here legally, which is the way it ought to be done. We frequent a Chinese restaurant on a regular basis. Most lovely people you'll ever meet, but they're here legally. That's the way it ought to be done. Or you end up with the kinds of problems that Lebanon now has. They just simply can't really care for all of this influx of people. So we've done Palestine, Israel, which is the region between Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, and the Mediterranean coast. To the east is Lebanon. To the north, or to the east is Jordan, pardon me. To the north is Lebanon and Syria. And when you look at the Fertile Crescent, that takes us up and makes that turn. We looked at Iraq and Iran. We touched briefly, just by reference, to Afghanistan, and we've looked at Turkey. We're rapidly running out of places to go, which is a good thing because I'm working on the study that will follow this. And we're going to remain in here because it's also going to utilize PowerPoint to a great extent and be looking at a number of questions that are quite popular today and how Christians answer them from the standpoint of the existence of God and the problem of evil and suffering and stuff along that line. Turkey. Turkey is a rather large geographic area and was the core of the Ottoman Empire. And again, you have to know a little history to appreciate this. The Ottoman Empire is not mentioned in Scripture, but it was very prominent. It was Muslim in its makeup, and therefore had an element of conquest about it. There were a couple of times when the empire nearly succeeded in conquering the West. Fortunately failed. By West, I don't mean North America, but Western Europe. This is what is called Asia, or Asia Minor in the New Testament. The center of the Ottoman Empire reached its peak in the 16th century, especially during the reign of Solomon the Magnificent. And the empire remained powerful and influential. I know you can read this, but I need to say something. For 200 years or so, until it suffered some setbacks. There was a Greek-Turkish war. There was a Russian-Turkish war. And as a result, the Ottoman Empire was forced to cede territories in Europe to victors. And it really signaled the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria formally declared independence in October of 1908. Bulgaria had been a part of the Ottoman Empire. Due to the Italian-Turkish wars, a Balkan League was formed, and there were, again, defections, and just gradually the Ottoman Empire grew smaller and smaller. In 1913, there was a coup d'etat. And the empire essentially came to an end, and three pashas came to power, and they essentially ruled together over this region. And it is the pashas who made the decision, the three pashas, to align themselves with Central Powers in World War I when they were defeated. That meant the end of the Ottoman Empire. So during the war, the Ottoman government committed ethnic cleansing. Have you heard over the last several years references to this and how you have to be so careful because the Turks still will not acknowledge that they did this, and so you can't speak of it because it offends the Turkish government, and the Turks are part of NATO. We'll get to that in a minute, and therefore we're aligned with them, or they're allies of ours, and you've got to speak well of your friends, all kinds of things. The fact of the matter is it happened, and if they won't admit it, doesn't make it any less true. Following the war, there was a conglomeration of territories and peoples that compromised the former empire, divided into several new states. And what did we say when we began this study, if you can remember all the way back then? One of the problems with that region even to this day is because of the lines in the sand. without any regard to religion or ethnicity or any of the other externals. The British and the French essentially decided, we'll just draw lines as territories and we'll distribute them. They're rich in oil, we'll just take them over, and that's why in Iraq we have all of these divisions, not just divisions in terms of religion, Sunni and Shia, but ethnicity, they're Kurds and others, and it would have been so much better. The Kurds are still fighting right now for territory in Iraq to have their own country. So when you start trying to figure out how to have peace, say, in a place like Iraq, it's not unto impossible, because the Sunni and the Shia are not going to get along, and the Kurds don't want to get along with them because they want their own specific geography in northern Iraq to become at least autonomous, if not a separate nation. And the Iraqis are not willing to allow that, because that would put Mosul under Kurdish control, and Mosul's a rich oil area, and the Iraqis are not about to give that up to the Kurds. So there are a whole lot of factors involved in what's going on in the Middle East, beyond just the Muslim desire for a caliphate and ultimately to dominate the world. There's all these other things that are coming into play, and much of it goes back to what happened at the end of World War I and thereafter, and how lines were drawn. The Turkish War of Independence, fought from 1919 to 1922, eventually led to the establishment of the modern Republic of Turkey in 1923. Turkey is a member, as I said, of the UN. Well, I may have not said that, but a member of NATO. It's also, of course, an early member of the UN, NATO, and a founding member of several other organizations. So it's been a fairly stable and prosperous country for some time now. Islam, however, is the dominant religion, but Turkey has not had, as, say, Iran does today, the Ayatollahs in charge. They've had democratically elected governance from the beginning of the nation back in the 1920s. But it is, to the greatest extent, Muslim in terms of religious makeup. If you're reading the board, there's some discrepancy, but clearly 95+% of the people identify as Muslims. I remember, been a few weeks ago now, Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey shot down a Russian plane because it crossed the Syrian border into Turkey, and the Turks shot it down. There was talk of that being a major, international incident. What do we do if the Russians invade over this? Because they are NATO, and NATO members are sworn to come to the defense if any of their fellow members are attacked. Well, it essentially amounted to nothing. I'm not even sure why they shot it down, I guess just because they could. They've been a staunch ally of the U.S., but it appears that things may be changing in Turkey. Their present leader, Erdogan, recently suffered a coup attempt where some in the military tried to rise up and take over. Unsuccessful, because he's taking the nation back toward a more Islamic footing, and the people seem to applaud that, so they rallied to his defense, and he has eliminated a whole bunch of people who were in power in Turkey, military folk and staffs and embassies, particularly any who might have been supportive of the coup have been removed. And Turkey is headed at this time in a direction that will make them more Islamic, which is obviously not a really good thing. This is a picture, it's not a very good picture, but a picture of the Hagia Sophia. And that's originally a church in Turkey, but it was taken over by Muslims and turned into a mosque. But since Turkey was not an Islamic state, it was turned into a museum, and everybody had right and access to it. And I put it up here to give you an indication of the direction that Turkey is going as a country. The Turkish government has announced, it did so about a month ago, that it's appointed a permanent imam at the Hagia Sophia. What was for almost 100 years has been a museum is now going to revert, obviously, to a religious site for Muslim practitioners. Originally, they said that they would just have an imam there calling Muslims to prayer a couple times a day. Now, and that happened very quickly, he's now calling Muslims to prayer 5 times a day, which is what they typically do in their faith. This is the region where Noah's Ark, when I say region, part of Turkey, Asia Minor in the scriptures was Armenia, and the mountains of Ararat, where the ark came to rest, would have been in what is now modern Turkey. We've already talked about it being Asia Minor. Several of Paul's letters were written to churches in this region, and all 7 of the letters in Revelation 2 and 3 from Jesus to the church at Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamos, Thyatira, you know the story. All of those churches located in what is now modern Turkey. And to my knowledge, there are now no congregations of the Lord's Church in any of those cities or the remnants of those cities, but they were thriving churches 2,000 years ago. John's got his finger here on the buzzer in a minute. We're going to pick it up next week with the Mediterranean. We're going to look at Paul's missionary tours very quickly, his journey to Rome, and wrap this study up in the very near future. So if you're following along, you realize that that part of the world that is in turmoil today, Iraq and Iran and Syria, that's the part of the world that's been in turmoil since the world began almost. It is the heartbed of human civilization. It's generally believed now that civilization got started in Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf, and spread out from there. Obviously, when you look at the biblical narrative of Genesis and the story of Noah and the flood, human civilization got its second start when they left the ark and Shem, Ham, and Japheth began to spread out, and the command was to be fruitful, to replenish the earth, and they went in all directions. Everybody alive today traces their lineage to one of those 3 sons. But this is the land where it all really began, and it's in turmoil.